What if I told you that the skies above some of the world's most carefully monitored cities contain patterns that have persisted for decades? Patterns that challenge everything we think we know about airspace security. While most people associate unexplained aerial phenomena with remote deserts or isolated military bases, some of the most compelling evidence suggests these objects follow specific routes, corridors that pass directly over major population centers, repeatedly, predictably, and without explanation. Tonight, we're going to explore something that remains hidden in plain sight. We're going to examine why certain locations, particularly densely populated and heavily monitored regions, seem to serve as waypoints for unexplained aerial activity. We're not here to make extraordinary claims or jump to sensational conclusions. Instead, we're going to look at documented patterns, credible witness testimony, and the geographic consistency of sightings that suggests something far more structured than random occurrences. This is about understanding the architecture of mystery itself, about recognizing that what appears chaotic may actually follow rules we haven't yet identified. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why the concept of aerial corridors matters, why trained observers in controlled environments continue to report objects they cannot identify, and what these patterns might reveal about the limitations of our surveillance systems. So settle in, because we're about to examine one of the most overlooked aspects of the UAP phenomenon, the geography of the unexplained, and what it tells us about the invisible structure of our skies.
We live in an age where we've convinced ourselves that nothing moves through our airspace unobserved. Every commercial flight is tracked in real time. Military radar systems scan the horizons continuously. Satellite networks monitor from above, while ground stations coordinate from below. The entire system operates with such precision that we can watch aircraft cross oceans on our phones, following their progress mile by mile. This sense of total awareness creates a powerful illusion. We assume that if something unusual were flying through controlled airspace, someone would know immediately. Authorities would respond. Explanations would follow. The system, we believe, leaves no room for ambiguity. But this confidence rests on a foundation more fragile than most realize. Our surveillance systems are optimized for specific tasks. Radar networks are designed to track objects with known characteristics, aircraft that emit transponder signals, that fly at expected speeds and altitudes, that follow predictable patterns. These systems filter aggressively, eliminating returns that don't match their parameters. Atmospheric interference, weather clutter, and electronic noise create false signals constantly, so operators learn to ignore anything that doesn't fit established threat profiles. This filtering is not negligence, it's necessity. During periods of high traffic, radar screens cannot afford ambiguity. Controllers focus on what matters for safety and security. Slow-moving objects, hovering targets, or returns without transponder signals often get dismissed automatically. They don't match the template of what the system is built to detect.
Consider what this means in practice. An object could pass through monitored airspace and leave only the faintest trace. A brief radar return here, a visual observation there, nothing sustained enough to trigger alarms or demand investigation. Unless it poses an immediate threat to aircraft or violates restricted zones, it might simply be noted and forgotten. The system continues operating smoothly and the anomaly dissolves into background noise. This gap between perception and reality becomes particularly significant in densely monitored regions. Places with heavy commercial traffic, active military zones, and overlapping radar coverage seem like they should be the most transparent. Instead, the constant motion creates camouflage. When everything is moving, when the sky is never empty, subtle anomalies can hide within the complexity itself. The regions we consider most secure may actually be the most vulnerable to unnoticed intrusions, not because the systems fail, but because they succeed too well at their designed purpose while remaining blind to everything else. This is the paradox at the heart of modern airspace management. The better we become at tracking what we expect, the less we notice what we don't.
When researchers began examining UAP sightings across multiple decades, an unexpected pattern emerged. Reports weren't distributed randomly. They clustered along specific geographic features, coastlines, major flight paths, approaches to airports, and boundaries between controlled and uncontrolled airspace. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across landscapes. They followed routes. The term corridor describes this phenomenon precisely. It suggests not a destination, but a passage, a path that something follows repeatedly over time. The concept challenges our assumptions about how unexplained phenomena should behave. Random appearances would suggest natural causes or misidentifications, but movement along consistent paths implies structure, navigation, perhaps even purpose, though not necessarily purpose we can understand. Several factors characterize these corridors. First, they align with existing human infrastructure. Objects appear along routes that mirror commercial aviation paths, near military installations, or following coastlines where maritime and aerial activity converge. This alignment suggests either a relationship to human activity or a preference for the same geographic features that humans find strategically valuable: waterways, flat terrain, proximity to population centers. Second, the corridors cross jurisdictional boundaries. A sighting in one region often connects temporally to reports elsewhere along the same route. An object seen over a coastal platform might be reported inland hours later. A formation observed crossing one country's airspace appears in a neighboring nation's records days afterward. These connections only become visible when data is compared across borders, which happens rarely due to bureaucratic fragmentation. Third, corridors tend to favor liminal spaces, edges rather than centers. They pass over water, follow coastlines, transit between urban and rural areas. These are zones where surveillance overlaps imperfectly, where responsibility shifts between agencies, where monitoring systems have gaps. Whether this preference is deliberate or coincidental remains unclear, but the pattern persists. Understanding corridors requires thinking beyond individual sightings. Each report becomes a data point in a larger geographic pattern. When mapped over time, these points form lines, routes that suggest movement rather than randomness. The objects don't appear to be wandering aimlessly. They seem to be going somewhere or coming from somewhere, following paths that offer the least resistance or maximum advantage for reasons we can only speculate about. This geographic consistency also explains why certain locations accumulate reports while others remain quiet. It's not that some places are more prone to misidentifications or have more credulous populations. It's that these locations sit along routes that something uses repeatedly. The density of reports reflects position along the corridor, not the psychological tendencies of witnesses. The corridor hypothesis doesn't answer what these objects are or where they originate. It simply acknowledges that their appearances follow patterns, that these patterns align with geography, and that geography itself may be a crucial variable we've overlooked in trying to understand the phenomenon. If something moves through our airspace following specific routes over decades, then perhaps the question isn't what it is, but where it's going and why these particular paths matter. One of the most striking aspects of corridor-related sightings is who reports them. These aren't typically civilians prone to misidentification or eager for attention. They're professionals whose work requires acute observational skills, pilots who spend thousands of hours scanning skies, air traffic controllers trained to detect anomalies on radar, police officers accustomed to unusual situations, and offshore workers familiar with every aircraft and vessel that should be in their area. These observers share something critical. They know what belongs.
A commercial pilot can distinguish aircraft types by silhouette and movement pattern. A radar operator recognizes the signature of weather versus solid objects. A police officer on patrol knows the normal rhythm of their city's sky. When these professionals report something anomalous, they're not saying they saw something strange, they're saying they saw something that violated their understanding of what's possible. Yet these credible reports face a consistent barrier. The training that makes these observers reliable also creates institutional pressure to minimize what they've seen. Pilots who report unusual objects risk professional consequences. Controllers who log anomalies without radar correlation may face questions about their judgment. Police officers filing reports about lights in the sky often find their accounts buried in paperwork, never escalated, never investigated. This creates a peculiar dynamic. The most qualified observers are also the least likely to speak openly. Their credibility depends on appearing rational, unflappable, and focused on their duties. Reporting something unexplained threatens that credibility, so they self-censor, mention observations only informally, or file reports that use neutral language designed to avoid triggering scrutiny.
The result is an archive of forgotten observations. Logbooks contain brief entries about unknown traffic. Flight records mention objects that appeared visually but not on instruments. Police databases hold scattered reports of aerial anomalies, each treated in isolation, none connected to broader patterns. These records exist, but they remain dispersed across agencies and jurisdictions, never compiled, never analyzed for correlations. When civilian researchers gain access to these archives through information requests, they discover the same themes recurring. Objects that move in ways conventional aircraft cannot. Lights that hover without sound. Shapes that maintain formation without visible propulsion. The descriptions align across decades and locations, suggesting witnesses are observing the same category of phenomenon, even if they can't identify what that category represents. The professional observer faces another challenge beyond institutional pressure. They often lack language for what they've experienced. Aviation terminology describes known aircraft behavior. Radar terms categorize expected returns. Police procedures handle identifiable threats. But what vocabulary exists for an object that hovers silently, accelerates impossibly, or disappears without trace? Witnesses struggle to articulate observations that fall outside established frameworks, and that struggle makes their reports seem vague or unreliable, even when they're trying to be precise. This linguistic limitation reinforces the tendency to minimize. If you can't describe what you saw in terms your profession recognizes, perhaps it's easier to assume you were mistaken. Perhaps the object was farther away than it seemed, or atmospheric conditions distorted perception, or fatigue affected judgment. The mind reaches for explanations that restore order, even when those explanations don't quite fit. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for evaluating corridor sightings. The most compelling reports often come from people who hesitated for years before speaking, who checked with colleagues to confirm they weren't alone in their observations, who finally came forward only when they realized the pattern was larger than their individual experience. These delayed disclosures don't indicate unreliability, they indicate the weight of professional consequence and the difficulty of challenging institutional assumptions. The relationship between visual observation and instrumental detection lies at the heart of corridor sightings. In ideal circumstances, these two sources of information align. Pilots see an object, radar confirms its presence, and authorities can respond appropriately. But corridor-related reports frequently involve a troubling divergence. Witnesses describe structured objects moving through controlled airspace, while radar systems show nothing, or show returns that don't match the visual description. This divergence creates immediate problems for investigators. Without instrumental confirmation, visual sightings become subjective. They can be attributed to misperception, atmospheric effects, or psychological factors. The absence of radar data doesn't prove nothing was there, but it removes the objective foundation that would make investigations straightforward. Several factors can explain why radar might miss objects that are visually observable. Radar systems have blind spots, particularly at lower altitudes where terrain interferes with coverage. They filter out slow-moving targets that might be birds or weather. They prioritize objects with certain radar cross-sections while ignoring others. An object flying low, moving slowly, or constructed from materials that don't reflect radio waves conventionally might pass through monitored airspace without leaving clear electronic traces. But this explanation, while plausible, raises uncomfortable questions. If objects can routinely transit controlled airspace without detection, what does that say about our security systems? If visual observers can see structured craft that radar cannot track, are we monitoring what we think we're monitoring? The gap between human perception and machine detection suggests either that our instruments have significant limitations or that human perception is more unreliable than we acknowledge.
Both possibilities carry implications. If instruments have limitations, then our confidence in total airspace awareness is misplaced. Gaps exist that could be exploited by conventional threats, let alone unconventional ones. If human perception is unreliable, then we must question even trained observers, which undermines the credibility of countless professional pilots, controllers, and military personnel who report anomalies. The institutional response to this dilemma has been consistent: minimize the discrepancy. When radar shows nothing, conclude that observers were mistaken. When observers insist they saw something structured, attribute it to unusual atmospheric conditions or distant aircraft misidentified. These explanations preserve system confidence by suggesting that gaps are perceptual rather than instrumental. But this approach accumulates unanswered questions. Why do atmospheric conditions that create illusions of structured craft appear preferentially along certain geographic corridors? Why do trained observers who successfully identify thousands of aircraft correctly suddenly become unreliable when reporting objects that don't match known profiles? Why do these misidentifications cluster around specific locations and times rather than distributing randomly?
The pattern suggests something more systematic than isolated perceptual errors. When multiple witnesses from different locations describe similar objects moving along the same route, when these descriptions recur across decades, when professional observers stake their credibility on what they've seen, the dismissal of every case as misidentification begins to feel less like explanation and more like evasion. There's also the question of motive. Why would observers fabricate or misinterpret sightings that bring them no benefit and considerable professional risk? The typical conspiracy theory relies on someone having something to gain, but most corridor witnesses gain nothing. They face skepticism, mockery, and career damage. Their accounts often remain anonymous precisely because coming forward openly carries such cost. This suggests the observations are genuine, even if their interpretation remains contested. The divergence between visual and instrumental detection doesn't prove anything extraordinary. It simply reveals the limitations of both methods. Instruments cannot see everything, and humans sometimes misinterpret what they see. But when credible observers consistently report objects that instruments miss, and when those reports follow geographic patterns, the situation demands more than dismissal. It demands investigation into why these gaps exist and what they might reveal about what moves through our skies undetected.
Perhaps the most telling aspect of corridor phenomena isn't what has been investigated, but what hasn't. For decades, military and civilian aviation authorities have maintained a posture of deliberate restraint regarding unexplained aerial observations. This isn't necessarily conspiracy. More often, it's procedural inertia and institutional preference for certainty over ambiguity. When a pilot reports an unusual object, the immediate question authorities ask is whether it posed a threat. If the object interfered with flight operations, violated restricted airspace, or appeared hostile, response protocols activate. Investigators gather data, review radar, interview witnesses. But if the object simply appeared and vanished without incident, the response is often minimal. A note in a log, perhaps a brief internal report, and then nothing.
No follow-up, no pattern analysis, no attempt to connect the observation to similar reports from other times or locations. This triage approach makes sense for operational efficiency. Authorities cannot investigate every ambiguous sighting. Resources are limited, safety concerns take priority. But this efficiency comes at a cost. It prevents pattern recognition. Each sighting is treated as an isolated incident rather than a potential data point in a larger phenomenon. The connections that would reveal corridor structures remain invisible because no one is looking for them. The silence extends beyond individual cases to systemic issues. National airspace authorities rarely share data across borders. Military and civilian agencies operate separate databases with minimal integration. Police departments handle unusual aerial reports locally without coordinating with aviation authorities. This fragmentation ensures that even if patterns exist, they remain fractured across jurisdictional boundaries.
Civilian researchers who attempt to compile this scattered data face significant obstacles. Records are incomplete, access is restricted, and agencies often resist releasing information about unexplained sightings, not because the information is classified, but because acknowledging uncertainty creates public relations challenges. It's simpler to say nothing than to admit that objects pass through controlled airspace without identification. This institutional silence has shaped public perception profoundly. The absence of official acknowledgement suggests either that nothing unusual is occurring or that anything unusual has prosaic explanations. The public assumes that if something significant were happening, authorities would say so. But this assumption misunderstands how bureaucracies handle ambiguity. They don't announce uncertainty, they minimize it, file it away, and move on. The result is a knowledge gap. Thousands of credible observations exist in scattered archives, but they never coalesce into a comprehensive picture because no institution has taken responsibility for synthesizing them. The data exists, but the analysis doesn't. The observations are documented, but the patterns remain unrecognized.
Recent shifts in official attitudes suggest this silence may be eroding. Governments are beginning to acknowledge that unexplained aerial phenomena deserve study, not because they're necessarily extraordinary, but because gaps in airspace awareness represent security concerns regardless of origin. This represents a significant change, a movement from denial toward cautious inquiry. But decades of silence cannot be reversed quickly. Witnesses who stayed quiet for years may not come forward now. Records that were never properly preserved may be lost. Patterns that could have been identified earlier may be harder to reconstruct. The cost of institutional restraint compounds over time, and that cost is measured in questions that could have been answered but weren't. Understanding corridor phenomena requires acknowledging this history of silence, recognizing that absence of evidence reflects institutional priorities rather than absence of occurrences. The skies above our most monitored regions have never been as transparent as we believed. Objects have passed through, been observed, and then vanished into bureaucratic archives where their significance was buried beneath procedural indifference.
Among all the recurring features in corridor sightings, one stands out for its consistency across decades and locations: the triangular form. Witnesses separated by years and continents describe large, dark, triangular objects moving silently through night skies. These aren't vague lights or ambiguous shapes, they're structured craft with distinct geometry, 3 points defining clear edges, often with lights at each corner, and sometimes a central illumination. The descriptions aligned with remarkable precision. Witnesses described the same smooth, deliberate movement, the same silence, the same sense of scale. These objects don't dart erratically like conventional aircraft maneuvering. They glide, maintaining stable orientation, following straight paths, occasionally hovering before resuming motion. The movement suggests control and purpose, not mechanical flight, but something more fluid.
This consistency is difficult to explain through conventional means. If these were misidentifications of aircraft, the descriptions should vary based on viewing angle, lighting conditions, and aircraft type. Instead, they remain remarkably uniform. If they were atmospheric phenomena, they shouldn't maintain geometric forms or controlled flight paths. If they were hallucinations or fabrications, we wouldn't expect such detailed agreement across independent witnesses who never communicated. The triangular form appears in military contexts and civilian ones. It's been reported over bases and over suburbs, near coasts and inland, during exercises and during quiet periods. This distribution suggests the objects aren't exclusively military technology, at least not technology confined to scheduled operations. They appear too widely, too consistently across too many contexts to represent a single classified program.
Some researchers propose that these triangular craft represent advanced human technology, stealth aircraft, or experimental platforms developed in secret. This explanation has merit. Military development programs do exist that public awareness lags behind by years or decades. What seems impossible to civilians might be operational in classified contexts. But several aspects of triangular sightings resist this explanation. The objects appear at low altitudes over populated areas without announcement or airspace restrictions. They're observed in regions where testing unacknowledged technology would be diplomatically and politically sensitive. They've been reported consistently since at least the late 70s, which would require a technology to have remained secret and operational for over 4 decades, while appearing regularly in civilian airspace. Additionally, no known propulsion system explains the complete silence witnesses describe. Even advanced stealth aircraft produce sound. Helicopters generate downwash. Drones have limited size and endurance. The triangular objects reported in corridor sightings are described as large, often compared to commercial aircraft in scale, yet they move without any audible signature. This combination of size, silence, and controlled movement doesn't match any publicly acknowledged technology.
The alternative explanations become increasingly strained. Perceptual errors don't account for multiple witnesses observing the same object simultaneously from different locations. Atmospheric effects don't explain consistent geometric forms. Secret military craft don't explain appearances in sensitive foreign airspace without coordination. What remains is a category of observation that fits no convenient explanation. These objects exist in witness testimony and occasionally in photographic or video evidence. They follow patterns, appearing along corridors, moving deliberately, maintaining forms that suggest structure and control. Whether they represent advanced human technology, something else entirely, or a phenomenon we haven't categorized, they persist in the record, unexplained but undeniably observed. The triangular form serves as a through line in corridor research, a recurring element that links sightings across time and space. When witnesses who never met describe the same shape moving the same way in the same geographic corridor, the observation demands attention. It suggests that whatever these objects represent, they're not random, not isolated, and not easily dismissed.
As we conclude this exploration, we're left not with answers, but with better questions. The concept of aerial corridors doesn't solve the UAP mystery. It reframes it. Instead of asking whether unusual objects exist, we can ask why they appear where they do, why certain routes seem to matter, and what the geographic consistency of sightings reveals about patterns we haven't recognized. Throughout this examination, several themes have emerged consistently. Credible observers continue to report objects they cannot identify. These reports cluster along specific geographic features and flight paths. The objects demonstrate characteristics that resist conventional explanation: silent movement, controlled flight, geometric consistency. And institutional responses remain inadequate. fragmented by jurisdiction, limited by procedure, constrained by reluctance to acknowledge uncertainty. None of this proves anything extraordinary, but it demonstrates something important. Our surveillance systems have gaps. Our understanding of our own airspace is less complete than we assume, and phenomena we cannot explain persist despite our technological sophistication. The corridor concept matters because it shifts focus from individual sightings to systemic patterns. It suggests that researchers should map sightings geographically, compare reports across borders, and analyze whether objects move along routes rather than appearing randomly. This approach might reveal structure where chaos seemed to reign, patterns that could lead to better questions and eventually to understanding.
For now, the corridors remain. Objects continue to transit through monitored airspace, observed by professionals who stake their credibility on what they've seen, recorded in scattered archives that no one synthesizes, following paths that recur across decades. They move silently above cities convinced of their own transparency, through skies we believe we control completely. Perhaps the most important realization is this: the unknown persists not because we lack technology, but because we lack the institutional will to examine what our technology cannot easily explain. The data exists, the patterns are there. What's missing is the courage to acknowledge that our maps of reality might have blank spaces, regions we've assumed were charted, but which remain, in crucial ways, unexplored. The corridors ask us to look up with fresh eyes, to set aside assumptions about what should be possible, and to recognize that the sky above us, familiar as it seems, may contain movements and presences we've only begun to notice. Not with fear, not with sensationalism, but with the patient curiosity required to understand anything genuinely unknown. The patterns are there, waiting to be recognized. The question is whether we're ready to see them.